Good afternoon. My name is Perry King. I'm the Communications Officer here at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and I wish to welcome you all to our latest episode of Writers Roost, a web series where Jeff Myers speaks with fellow OISE alumni, whether they are changemakers, world-class thinkers, movers and shakers, about the books they have written. It's great to have our community come together on what is a wet snow occasion in the GTA. From wherever you are, I hope you are in for what is going to be a very engaging conversation featuring Dr. Barbara Smith, who has published a wonderful book titled, How Much Does a Great School Cost? Okay, before we proceed, a couple things. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And we are grateful to have this opportunity to have this great conversation. Just a couple technical notes for you. Closed captioning is available if you click the button below at the bottom. As well, due to unfortunate recent circumstances occurring at OISE, of which was of racist nature. We have decided to disable our chat today for this meeting, and our Q&A section will only make answered questions available later in this conversation. We're just ensuring that our web-based and our community is safe from harm, especially in this case from racist harm. Okay, so allow me to introduce our speakers for this wonderful conversation. Jeff Myers is a proud OISE graduate, a double graduate actually, and a former president and treasurer of the OISE Alumni Association. He has spent much of his career working internationally and in Toronto in the field of educational administration in both the public and private sectors. Jeff joins us today from Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, his hometown, where he currently serves as the Director of Community Partnerships and Projects in the Faculty of Open Learning and Career Development. And Jeff is being joined by Dr. Barbara Smith, a passionate educator who challenges the boundaries of sameness, in quotes, in schools. Smith's background includes over 40 years in public, charter, independent, and international schools. Barbara has started 3 schools and has been a teacher, a principal, a consultant, a trustee, and a teacher educator here at OISE, McGill University, and University of Saskatchewan teaching faculties and graduate schools. Barbara now spends her time writing and supporting schools and school systems to generate progressive operations and customized curriculum grounded in constructive and engaging practices. Smith is committed to repurposing budgets to local support school improvement, and she's written a wonderful book, possibly reflecting this material. So I'll give this to you, Jeff. I hope you guys have a great time.
Thanks so much, Perry, and welcome, Barb. Nice to meet you. I actually didn't meet you during my time at OISE, but I'm really delighted to have this chance to talk to you about your book. As Perry said, I'm coming to you from Dalhousie University, which is in Halifax, and on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are all treaty people, and I encourage all Canadians to learn about and from the Indigenous people of the place that they call home. Barb, this is such a great book, and it's slightly provocatively titled, I might argue. How much does a good school cost? And I'm sure there are lots of answers to that question. It's also a book that I found very methodical, super wide-ranging, visionary in nature, and clearly grounded in a lot of experience. So I sent you some questions in advance. I'll go in and out of those, and maybe not necessarily in the order that we started in, but I will start with the number one question, which is, tell us about the book. What's it about? Why did you write it? And why is this topic important?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Sim, who's in the background doing a lot of the organization for these Writers Roost activities. And also, Perry, thank you for the introduction. And Jeff, I was really pleased that you really dug into the book, because when you sent me some sample questions, I could tell that you didn't just do a superficial glance of this book. You really got into the meat of it. And basically the reason I wrote it was so that people would get not into the meat of solutions or answers, but into the meat of saying, wow, what are some outlier ideas that we could really consider when we're trying to always look at innovation in schools, but also school improvement. So I thank you, Jeff, for those insightful questions. And I basically will start and say that the book, it emerged after I had done interviews with some close colleagues of mine and a lot of folks that I met on LinkedIn, for example, who are really interested in wanting to contribute their idea of what great was. So the book actually is in 5 sections. So the first section, it really is about building roads not taken. So really getting people to think about what other paths, we might consider and what are the different contexts that could consider them. So a charter school is very different than a public school, than a regular public school, I should say, because I think a misnomer is that a charter school is not a public school. And indeed it is, because it is funded publicly. Independent schools, because there's tuition involved, very different kind of context as well. And there are things that by being involved in a lot of these schools and in international schools as well, it gave me some I guess, a different kind of insight into maybe the strengths in one school context might be different than another. So I really spoke about that, distinguishing that, this isn't one answer to the question, as you say, how much does it cost? Well, it costs different things depending on the different kinds of revenue bases and so on that the schools are operating under. And then I got right to the point of trying to say, what is that definition of greatness? I thought that was important to make sure that that's up front. And that wasn't a definition that I decided on, but I looked at what were the responses from these 16 folks who decided to contribute. And there were 3 themes that emerged. And one theme was inspired learning. One theme was responsible action. And the other theme was inclusive environment. And those 3 were common, and how the words that they used may not have been exactly those words, but those were the themes. And so based on that, I was able to always go back and say, now what about innovative practices that fall under those categories? So it helped, kind of gave me a bit of a rudder in the book. The second section is called What's Worth Changing For? So all of these great activities and ideas that are overwhelming for many teachers out there, like how do you do them all? It's not necessarily possible to do everything, but there should be a concerted effort to synthesize something that is going to be meaningful for the students, and that it is aiming towards greatness, not just for students, but for the experience that teachers have. And even more recently, the fact that many teachers are looking at exiting the system and not being, part of this career is something. It's now my next book that I'm worried I'm writing about right now, because I'm very concerned about, well, how can you make it a more attractive profession? And I believe that a lot of the ideas about, obviously reducing classroom size and not having more than 20 kids in a class, that's obviously very appealing, because then you actually get to do your craft. Now, that's like straightforward, but there's a lot of other ideas about, if you're going to teach social studies, is it social science? Is something like Model UN? Is that something that's not just a little club after school for 30 kids in your school, but because it's such a direct applied understanding and application of learning about the sustainable goals of the UN, if you take 5 years of history in high school, why can't one term at least be dedicated to that? So there's so many things outside that will, I think now, even after the pandemic, has forced us to sort of discover what else might be there that's perhaps more engaging. So this goes into great detail on many different traditional subject areas, but it also brings up a lot of new ideas for new subject areas. And what about multi-age learning? And we've known for years these are good practices, but are they, integrated into the school system? And the idea of changing staff roles and so on, it goes into quite a bit of depth. So then the third section is called, how can we afford change? So everyone always uses the we don't have the money for it when it comes down to not implementing innovation and new initiatives. But if you're moving backward design from your school values about what's important, you'd be surprised at what is affordable. And that's why in that particular section, I was fortunate enough to have 4 of the participants who said they wanted to share some ideas about greatness in schools. 4 folks donated their budgets that we could go by and examine them. So it's one thing to sort of talk about budgets, but it's one thing to actually look at some real budgets. And so that goes into that in a very small scale. It's not, replicable, but it certainly is something that makes you look at how are those values reflected in the line items in the budget. The 4th section basically is about imagine if. And so I designed a new school, not the new school, but based on a lot of these things. How do you put all this together? And what would the day in the life of a teacher be? What would the day in the life of a student be in a school that actually generated these kinds of ideas of greatness? And finally, really talking about the currency of change, and that we talk so much about change is important, but you can't have change in isolation of changing a budget. It just can't happen. They're not separate silos. They have to be looked at together. So when I had to be involved in setting up 3 brand new schools, that allowed me to be able to look at all facets of a school and all areas that could be attributed to trying to improve a sense of greatness in everything that happens. So in a nutshell, that's what the breakdown of the sections of the books are. And it didn't start out that way. It emerged as information was gathered and so on. And the more I was writing, the more it broke out into that. But the reason I did it is because certainly the budgets that exist today, just one example, I was in a school and they said, well, here's a budget from another school. You can use that because you got to have like a budget. And I said, well, that budget's it's for the values of that other school. So just because it was a budget that passed an audit, doesn't mean that that's really the best budget for that particular school. So I really felt that if you are going to really talk and act on change, then you have to be willing to change a budget. And this really speaks about how that can be done.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up question to that? Because you almost sort of suggest with that final answer that every school should have its own set of values. But is there not a sense in which there are some higher level values that, well, certainly all schools in a given jurisdiction, or even maybe all publicly funded schools should be hewing to? Or are you saying that every school needs to understand its values and sort of build the budget around that?
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's really possible to take like everything we know now and put that into one particular school. I think some schools are going to be focused in different areas. One school I was involved in was an entrepreneurial school that had an emphasis in environmentalism. Those were 2 very unique combinations, but the curriculum wound itself around that. So the needs of that particular school in terms of the kind of staffing and everything else they did might be, very different than a school in Detroit where we were working on leadership was the main theme of that school. I think schools need more than simply being a school. I think that when the centralized governments or states have they mandate, this is what the report card looks like, this is what all these things are done. Like a lot of colleagues that were principals didn't in a public system didn't have access to the budget. So they didn't have that autonomy to be able to shape the budget around the values of the school. So when that happens, it means all schools are the same, all kids are the same, all teachers are the same, and they're not. And if you want to celebrate critical and creative thinking, we have to look at how that structure is limiting what we do.
I'm really going off the road of the questions I sent you, but now you just drugged another question for me, which is how publicly available are budgets in schools? Not publicly, but are typically they available to the teaching staff, to the administration? And do you see differences between the types of schools in that regard?
I'm not an expert in because it exactly on from system to system and board to board, but they tend to have very, very large boards. So if you look up the Toronto District School Board, you're going to get an 80-page document that's the budget, and the budget may say generally staffing, but you don't know the breakdown of the staffing to the schools. That's all very internal, and that's fine. But it made it difficult for me to compare a traditional public school, and I could just sort of extrapolate what it might be based on the costs.
Right.
When you had independent schools and you have tuition coming in, you have other sources of revenue. But I did have the closest thing I came to that was having the paid per pupil amount when I was a principal in a school in two schools in the US, and the charter school. Therefore, you had your own charter board, and that board had to have the whole finances audited. But the role of the principal is like a combination in those schools of being the principal, the superintendent, and perhaps even a director. Because if you're going to even create a school, you have to know all those pieces, where in the public system, a lot of that is split up. So the question is always, well, what kind of autonomy is left for the traditional public school principal? Like, how much are they allowed to really drive the school beyond the standards that are set in place?
All right, so let me go back to the first section of the book, and you talk about all of the stakeholders in education as it applies to the managing the money, essentially, right? So you have a little section there on teachers, non-instructional staff, the leaders, the trustees, the experts, the parents, the taxpayers, and so on. And then there's this little mention at the end about like the students are essentially not really involved in that process. But I wonder why you didn't give them more real estate, because it occurs to me that students could play an interesting role. And you talked about Model United Nations. Well, think of all the interesting cross-cutting themes that you could learn engaging in the budget planning process, and maybe in a participatory budgeting type of model. So anything you want to say about that, about students being involved?
For sure. Time is probably, time is certainly an issue, and it's time to learn about education. That's very important. So I would actually, go out on a limb to say that we have trustees making decisions at the very top, the furthest away from the students, making these decisions about, how much schools will receive. And I would say, as much as students need to learn about education before being put in positions to not just sit at a table for budget decisions, but also even curriculum design, they need to learn about what that means. What is it? And so the time right now is a key theme through the book that says, if you don't provide time for teachers to learn about what they need to learn to be able to implement initiatives, and if you don't provide time for trustees to learn about education, if you don't provide time, or they don't make time, or maybe that's a prerequisite, I don't know. But I don't think that just giving someone a role and a vote is really necessarily going to be giving them the tools they need to be responsible. And so getting back to greatness, it has to be responsible action. And so therefore I would love to see, and I would love to write about experiences where people would look at that, whatever that 40 hours is in a week, and if they carved out 3 hours a week, and part of that was in teaching kids about peer teaching and how they would actually not just show up and be a reading buddy, but actually design lessons and so on, then that's very empowering. And I believe, from what my experience have been with students, that they can do these things. But I also think there needs to be a point where, to be responsible, you don't just get a role. There's got to be a piece to the development of that. And that's why I really didn't go into it. And in a big way, that would be an ideal, because I haven't had the experience myself to be able to know if that's of value. Everything in this book may sound like a fantasy sometimes, and some of the things that have been done, but they've all been done. But that is something that I would love to do, but I haven't done that yet. And the door's open for that one. I think it'd be awesome.
That can be your next book. So we'll wait for that. We'll wait for that one.
There's a couple down there, yeah.
I mean, it's interesting what you just said, because I think the first section you said it's called The Roads Not Taken. But in fact, many of the things you talk about there those are roads that have been taken here and there, just not in a
Exactly.
systematic, collected way, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
In chapter 4, there's this beautiful nugget. It's just a tiny little sentence, but I underlined it and it made me think about so many things. And it reminded me of the title of the book is actually not just How Much Does a Great School Cost? Subtitle, School Economies and School Values. I think that's really important, because it's not only a book about the budgets of schools, but what values schools should have. So the line in chapter 4 that I love so much was, a sense of belonging is an important cultural feature of a great school. And I thought, wow, that's a profound statement, actually. So what does a sense of belonging in a school look like to you?
Well, as I mentioned, most of the ideas that are there weren't just sort of things that we cooked up and practically did them. Everything was grounded in research. And the research now on childhood depression and suicide is real. And the kids that don't belong, those are words that are used as big indicators of issues that need to be dealt with. So a lot of people have they talk a lot about belonging. They put nice posters up in hallways, and they have assemblies, and they do.
I can see it. You belong. I can totally see the poster.
Yeah. We all belong.
Yeah.
Where boys belong, and
Yeah.
all good. But it's just, what does that mean? And service learning, for example, is such a concrete experience that students can have. So when we set up the Jalen Rose Leadership Academy in Detroit, that was one of the things I wanted to deal with. We wanted all of these kids coming from 40 different schools coming in grade 9 and feeling that sense of belonging. And keeping a school small helps it belong. A principal who could name every single student in the school, usually 300 is a good number for that can work, even if it's only naming the students hear their name. That's on a very low level of belonging, but belonging is where all students feel safe and trust the adults in their community and the other students that they're with, their classmates. That's important. So trying to define, well, what does that look like? So when you have these kind of programs where they're doing things for others, like service learning or leadership activities or peer teaching or reading buddies and so on. These aren't just cute little extra things. These are huge in terms of making individuals feel part of that community. And we know from, I was in the States when Sandy Hook happened. I was there when Marjorie Douglas, and they've got 2,000 kids at that school. How could everyone feel a sense of belonging? So the bigger they make it, people are saying, and of course, I go into some detail in the budget, that it's a myth to be able to say the more kids you put into a school, the more you can save on electricity. There's no evidence, no research, nothing that provides any proof of that. But there's tons of proof that smaller schools have enormous impact on academics and social emotional learning. So it's important. And to me, that was the very first chapter to say, when you talk about what would be innovative ways to do curriculum, in that second part, what's worth changing is putting social emotional development right up front. Because, if they don't have their mental health and their feeling of belonging, then how are they going to approach their learning right across the board? And of course, this was written before COVID, and so and it was like delayed before it came out, and then COVID just made it even more obvious to people. But it was a serious problem before that, and again, it was like, well, if we have an advisory group, that will do it. That check, we've done. And I think it's got to be more pervasive, and it's got to be more connected and integrated in everything that happens with students. And it must be, evidence-based. What's the evidence of that transformation and that change? And you got to survey kids. You got to find out, how do you feel? And of course, that's not always a comfy thing to do, but that's a place to be able to determine if that's the case. So certainly, any school I've been involved in, I may not have always liked to hear everything they had to say, but it was my job to do something about it.
So let's talk about COVID for a second, because every book you read now in a nonfiction context is like, well, but what about COVID, right? It's like it's changed everything. So has it changed anything, or has it just highlighted existing issues for you, or has it changed your own thinking about school economies and values?
Um, not in terms of, what was presented. What it did was it increased the number of people who now care about social emotional learning, for sure. So for mental wellness in schools is now become a much bigger issue, and people are doing something about it, and lots of great ideas have come out of that. The idea of small classroom sizes, there's a body of research that says you don't need to have small classroom sizes, and it all doesn't come out of the curriculum literature. It comes out of other literature. But the bottom line is, if you have Vygotsky and constructivism at play, the best is one-on-one. Now, when you have a Zoom call and you've got 20 kids all around, yes, there's a problem. But if you've got 10 or 12, then all of a sudden you can have some deeper blended kinds of learning going on. So I think that the computer sort of brought to the forefront
Right.
ineffectiveness of larger classes, because the more a student has time to elaborate on what they know, rather than just put their hand up and give a one word or little phrase answer, the more they're moving from being a novice explorer of a subject area to an apprentice, because they're actually dialoguing, to an expert. And that is a much more powerful base and reason why we need smaller class sizes right across the board.
In the what if section, you intro that section by saying none of these things is a massive budget increase. None of these things is going to cost a lot of money. But the one on class size, in theory, does cost a lot of money, because you're saying, I think if I remember correctly, you said the best class size is about 15, and current class sizes are what, 25 to 30 in Ontario. So
Yeah.
that clearly would cost a lot of money.
That's if you're looking at one item at a time, because really the idea, and I was reading a lot from Michael Fullen's work when he was talking about repurposing budgets to find the money for technology. And we need the technology for equity purposes, and just it's the new it's a new part of the pencil case of today. It's not something that only some kids should have and other kids shouldn't. So when I read that, I was able to think, well, students really do need to be able to see the difference. I guess I'll back that up a little bit and say that there is a difference, and I think that what happens is you need to repurpose by changing the staffing rules in schools, and that can become very difficult depending on the number of folks that are going to be buying into the idea of, well, am I going to be a math and a science teacher now? Or am I going to be perhaps half of the day I'm going to spend as a mentor in a school and as a teacher leader, and the other half of the day I'm going to be teaching students. So it's actually, if most of your budget's going towards human capital, which is how much people are paid, then you've got to look at that, and that's what's got to change in order to have more funds available to make the class sizes smaller. Teachers will want the class sizes smaller, and it's not a question of pay them less. That's not the answer. They're professionals. They deserve the pay they get. So you have to look at how the other expenses are there, and by working on a small scale with schools of upwards of, I think, 800 in the 4 examples, it is doable. But it does mean that, people will have, you're looking for people that might have hybrid responsibilities. And I'll go into that maybe if you're asking questions about professional development. There's some examples that of coaching that are a little bit different than others, but that allows you to save money to be able to keep the class sizes smaller.
Yeah, you've got some great examples of that in the book. Actually, it was quite interesting. I want to ask about the line from President Joe Biden, though, because there's I think you intro it and mentioned it a couple of times later in the book. So the line is, "Don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value." So it was going through my head a lot in chapter 4 about service learning, because in a way, like, you could say that about almost any part of school infrastructure. show me your service learning options and I'll tell you what you value, right? So I just wondered if there's anything particular about the budget that is
Sure.
evocative of values.
Well, if you're having service learning, and let's say at one school, the example was we arranged for students to have a bus once a week, and they would go to a senior's home. And their goal was an integrated interdisciplinary project, but they had to write biographies of the seniors that were in the home. And so they would meet with them once a week, and they'd play cards, form relationships, and they would gather data about them each week, and they'd share what they found, and they spent the whole year. So what they wrote about in their main writing piece emulated what real writers do. They don't necessarily write different pieces every single day. That's not what Margaret Atwood does. So we were trying to emulate the best practices of writing and the editing and the whole process of gathering information. But that particular experience, it costs money to do that. We had to get a bus. And so I had to negotiate with a Baptist minister to say, this is what we're doing. We're not just going for a show in the holidays and we're doing something nice and away we go. So when I explained what it was, then he says, oh, I'll pay for the bus. So that was good. So you have to realize that it's not so much that was costs that were saved. But the supervision that goes into that, whoever is going on the bus with the students to modify them, you are paying those supervisors for that. So no matter what, values aren't necessarily separate. What values should do is drive what it is. And when you actually build out what these great values could be in a school, and then you figure out how much they cost, and then you look at what the general budgets are in these 4 sample schools, and you're saying, wow, it's doable. And that's what people probably don't think. You probably just think one line item versus another. You reduce the number, you need double the teachers, therefore it's going to be more. But it's very much a synthesized, very comprehensive view of knowing about every single line item in order to make those adjustments. And it's much easier when you're starting a school because you don't have people used to always having those same toys that they always had that they get to use. Because if you're going in to transform a school, then everybody's got to empty their pockets and realize what they take back may not be the same if you are serious about school change.
That's a really interesting point. Starting out fresh in a new school, it's sort of be much easier to do that than transforming something that exists.
Hard work. It's a lot harder work.
Yeah, fair enough.
But it allows you to dream more and bring people on board who are going to be supportive of taking these kind of risks.
And not fight culture at the same time as you're trying to transform the school, right? Yeah. Exactly. And then you have you have chapters on all of the different sort of subject areas in a school, and there's one on science and technology where you give you're talking about there's so many interesting, amazing things you can do on the internet to sort of flesh out your science and technology curriculum. It leads to a really interesting point about the role of teachers in 2022 being, or whatever he wrote the book, 2020, I guess, about the role of teachers being less about transferring a body of knowledge to be about being more of a coach, a guide, a mentor who provides context and pacing and scaffolding and sequencing, all those good things. So tell me a little bit more about that. How do you see the role of teachers today?
Well, I think we've known for 4 or 5, maybe more decades that there's so much information out there. There's no way that we can keep trying to jam it in the kids' heads. It's how they're using that information. And this is where it was very interesting having grown up in the Waterloo board. That was sort of my first school board that I worked in. I was a consultant there. And then, working in the Peel board and working at OISD and so on. So I had this, I was like a bit of a round, square peg in a round hole when I went to the DC charter system. And that was, in the last 20 years. And, it's something that the emphasis is different when it comes to standardized tests. So even though Ontario, even though people think, oh, well, it's US, it's not the same. Well, there are some things that are the same that are a concern. And some of the things is not being able to access not just technology, but being able to access, some of the better practices and informed practices that we know about, because they're all working in the US in a lot of these charter schools with these test preparation programs. So they basically read a paragraph and answer these multiple choice tests.
Right.
And this is what they're doing all day long. So no wonder the research on engagement after grade 5 is like, it's been going downhill for a long time, and there hasn't been any shifting. But there is now nano courses, there's master classes, there's micro credentials. There's all of these things that have kind of popped up even more after COVID, the pandemic situation, but they've always been there. So the challenge for the teacher isn't just being the guide, but also to be the person who's like a researcher or, resource collector and synthesize a resource. And teachers need to be curriculum designers. It's not enough to say, just give me the curriculum, give me the textbook, and I'll just do it. And you'll get that from some folks. But if you really want to be dealing with greatness, then, that's really responsible action, is to be able to, generate your own kind of feedback tools and your own assessment tools, and not relying blindly on something that has been commercially, put together with the assumption that, it must have been an expert that did this, so I will use it. Just as much as you want students to have the autonomy to be creative and critical thinkers, then how our professionals are treated and given the time they need to be able to generate and build these kinds of things is very empowering. But we give them, the worst example, I think, is the schools that have all the grade 4s come together, all the subject areas, and they have 45 minutes once a week, and they share what they've been doing. Okay. And then they go back. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute. Why not give them half a day off for a month at the end of each month, and they actually do the sharing for the 45 minutes, but then they actually develop some interdisciplinary kinds of projects and some work. There's no point in just sharing if there isn't any sense of what are you doing to bring it together, because we would never ask a teacher to teach 7 or 8 different subjects, which moves to the whole idea of innovative scheduling. How can we possibly teach that many subjects for those students at a time? And it does bring back the idea of what about semestering? And that's come to play a little bit more in after COVID, because they were like, well, wait a minute, we need them to go away after they get this and do something with it and then come back. But they're missing the whole going away and do something with stuff. They're simply just, okay, you got this stuff, memorize it, test coming up. Now you get some more stuff and then more stuff. And part of the problem is the curriculum is too dense to be able to do deep thinking with it. And so, yeah, we do need to change how and what is on the docket for what people have to learn.
Barb, I should have started out by telling the audience that we generally go for about 45 minutes. I'm shocked to see that we're really close to that. That tells me that we're having an amazing conversation. But I'll ask you just a couple more questions.
Sure.
You just hit on something I wanted to ask about, which is your own career. And in the book, you kind of slip in between Canada and the US as statistics and examples and so on. So obviously there are ways in which the two systems are very similar and other ways in which they're very different. So if you could touch on those 2 points for me.
Sure. I sort of spoke about it with the curriculum. The same problem is in the US. There may be 78 concepts in grade 3 English language arts that have to be learned, and the same would be in our system, let's say in Ontario, and there should be far fewer, and they should be weighted differently rather than looked at as all the same. And so most of the direction that we should be getting is from the research that comes out of really strong schools in the US and in Canada. OISE's a world leader. So the peer-reviewed research really matters. There's a little political part in the US in that they've created this university in New York called Relay University, and it kind of shortcuts people to become leaders of schools without any school experience at all. And Oh, okay, good. I was like, okay. But so they do have other influences in the US, where Canada tends to have much more rigorous peer-reviewed influence on what the curriculum in each province would be. The problem with both countries is there's the volume of expectations is too much. And it's not that you want to make it easier, you need to determine what is essential. And when you determine what's essential, it's doable, and there's time for students to be able to do much more rigorous work with that. So that's a commonality between both, but also can be a distinction depending on which school boards in the US, for example, are influenced by which universities. But for the most part, Stanford and Harvard, pretty important influences that they do have in most of the public schools there. Another distinction is the fact that there's fewer people going into the teaching profession in the US, that we still have a fair number of people very interested in applying to education. But we both now have the problem that after COVID and the blended learning, they're saying potentially there's 50% of the teaching force is considering exiting. So that to me is another similar problem that both have. And that may have a lot to do with the unrealistic expectations of what a teacher is expected to do. And I think we can make that more attractive, and we can make that more empowering for teachers. We've taken so much responsibility away from them that I think, it's time to consider that, that may be a very empowering piece of keeping people excited about the profession. Trying to think about, there's many other ways that are certainly different, but in terms of the content of some of the material that they learn in social studies, but for the most part, we're a lot more similar than we are different. And that's what I think is surprise to me when I went down there. The things that, peer teaching worked there, peer teaching worked here. I'd been in both communities working with a lot of these these methods, and they work in both contexts. We did also have people involved from international schools as well, but most of the international schools were influenced by North American peer-reviewed education. So
you just used the word we, and you used the word we several times in the book, and I wasn't sure if there was like an identifiable we, or just you always consider leadership to be part of a team, and so we are always we in that context. Is there a we?
I write too much with we. I know that. And for the most part, sometimes I may use we in the sense to say, look, we as a entity do something about this, is very general. But in the most cases, when I'm describing an example of something, that's something I actually was part of a team doing. So I wanted to be honest about it. Instead of talking about me in third person, not really being involved, I really had to be able to say that, that was part of what we did. And the one thing I think I used we about was when in DC, we sent 12 of our teachers to Harvard Project Zero. And most of these teachers had never left the city and always had, PD done by the principal, and that would have been it. And so we spent $35,000 in the budget to put them on planes, to, look after their accommodation and everything else. But it was something we wanted to do to increase the number of leadership positions at the school. And in order to save money, we made sure they came back. They had a half-time teaching position in the morning, but the afternoons, they were always free to mentor and work with other teachers. So instead of coaching and watching the teachers, they came back and they were able to spend an hour and team plan with the teacher on a Monday, and Tuesday they would go in and team teach with them. So every teacher had a very customized professional development ongoing throughout the year. So when I talk about we, I was very much involved in working with the teachers to set this up, rather than hire 3 or 4 coaches to walk around and kind of say, way to go, or write up about what they saw. We wanted the teacher mentors to be vulnerable and to be able to work in the context with the kids. So the development of those teachers that year was incredible. And so, that was something that I just wanted to share because it was a unique idea.
I said a couple more questions, but I really want to ask this question because I imagine it might be a slightly provocative part of the book. In chapter 18, you have a short section about schools generating their own revenue to offset short budget shortfalls or to creatively fund interesting things, right? So you give an innovative example of a car show, and I forget the other example, but there's debate around the ethics of schools generating their own revenue. So what are your thoughts on where the boundaries of that are? Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, I agree completely that there are situations when students go out and they're going to try to find funds to put more computers in schools and so on, and there's fundraising going on, and how fair is that if they're doing that in an affluent community? They're going to get more computers land at their feet than if they're going into a less affluent community who just don't have the funds to be able to add to that. And that's always going to be that's always going to be an issue. And I guess the idea there was, I was giving an example of what happens when a budget, there isn't going to be changing. People aren't going to allow a budget to change, but you want innovation to happen. So rather than give up on innovation, whatever the initiative might be, because it means that the idea of the kids doing car rally was more about kids being autonomous and actually applying what they learned and keeping, track of all of this and feeling a sense of accomplishment. And so it was much more about that than the funds that they, the purpose that they had set up to do that in. So I think that has to be really important as well. But if, for example, they were able to raise that and that's what they needed to do an innovative program, then the budget the next year is going to have to now say, is that more important than something else? And if so, they shouldn't have to raise the money for it. That should be built into the budget. And sometimes, like action research, for example, when teachers say, I want to do spelling dictations every week, and I say, well, if you could do some action research that actually proves that kids are more engaged and they're doing responsible action and so on, they're getting to that aim, then you are getting the tools you need to make that happen. And I'm not sure if just because it's money, it should be sacred. That's where I come down to saying you have to make sure they get the opportunity to do these practical experiences that are applying what they know and really addressing the issues of ethics for sure, to say, well, is that fair if we get to do that, but someone else down the street can't do that? How can we make that more fair for someone else to be able to get computers? And how can they get a hold of community agencies, for example, to be able to help support that? Because there's a lot of agencies, the Pinball Clemens group here in Toronto and the Calm Kids and so on. That's where it's like, okay, where do you go, rather than continuing to just allow certain affluent groups to always benefit. I mean, I purposely went into underprivileged schools for that reason, because, the privileged shouldn't be the ones getting the peer-reviewed, rigorous programming. And that tends to be what's not happening in the US, in the inner city schools.
All right, I probably asked you about half of my questions. So thanks for entertaining that. And that was such a fascinating discussion. I'll cut it there. I'll give the last word to you before Perry. Perry probably wants to pop back on and say a few things about OISE, but last words to you.
Oh, okay. I guess maybe what I'll do is I'll close with, I think it was almost my last paragraph in the book, but it really kind of encapsulates everything that I hope people will take away. Being aware of outlier ideas and ways to make change affordable goes hand in hand. Solutions do not have to be dependent upon new cash added to the fire. Change can come about through the redistribution of existing funds. The school budget is a barometer. By generating dialogue about what ideal schools can be, we can backward design from these value sets what it would cost to build and sustain them. And I will close in saying that when I used Biden's quote, it was like 4 years before, like that was the quote that started the book, and it took about 4 years to write it, but it was well before he even entered the presidential race. So it was timely. And of course, Dr. Jill Biden is very, excited about the book because it built on that theme that, look at the budgets and they'll tell you what you think are important, because you'll get manpower, you'll get time, you'll get all of those things that cost money to make it happen. So they really do have to change if you're serious about school improvement.
Beautiful. Thank you. That was a beautiful paragraph. Thank you for reading that out. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Perry, I'd invite you to come back on, and I know you have a couple of announcements to make. Oh, you're muted. It's 2022, so you're muted.
Every time. Happens every time. Unfortunately, we're so tight on time. There have been a few questions submitted. Barb, do you want to answer one question before we close proceedings?
Oh my gosh, I didn't even think of questions. I'm so sorry.
Yes, I'm just looking at them now in the Q&A. What might be examples of assumption, but maybe I was making assumptions about decision making. I will say that there was a time when in Ontario, the schools themselves could design their own report cards, for example, and all of that is centrally done. So this idea of 4-3-2-1 and so on is something that is taken away, that kind of autonomy from teachers and students. So that's one example. I think you were asking about. I'm sorry, I didn't answer the full question, Judith. I'm trying to read it as I go.
I can give you some guidance if you like, Barbara.
Sure.
Let's see. So Irene asks, what is the role of the teachers' union in all this? Presently, the unions are forced into adversarial positions.
I think if you're going to design ideal schools, you're designing ideal conditions for teachers. And so unions, it shouldn't be adversarial. We certainly, everyone who is a stakeholder has to play a role in, collegially designing, what's doable and things that they can do well. So right now, I believe all teachers are part of the union. So when I spoke about teachers and staff, I was really speaking inclusively about the teacher unions. But certainly it just depends if, state to state or province to province, what kind of things are being mandated. That again is something that would hopefully teacher unions would be standing up for increasing the autonomy of teachers in classrooms.
Okay, and just one more question, maybe. Erica asks, how can we encourage in transparency? You're so right, she says, about the need to empower teachers. And when the administration /SOs/trustees rarely, if ever, communicate specific budgets and priorities down the ladder, we cannot accurately propose impactful changes and projects.
Exactly. And I think that there's an age of transparency that's happening right across the board, I think, in quite a few areas. And if it's a public institution specifically, and also an independent school, you can access budgets. But I think I do speak quite a bit about there are line items in budget that can make things very cloudy and not transparent. There's a lot of words and phrases like, administrative expenses. Well, what do you mean by that? And that there are plenty of those kinds of things that are part of them. And I think, they do publish them. You can go on and see TDSBs and probably, Simcoe counties and everywhere else, but you don't walk away saying, what is the percentage that's going towards staff development? What is the percentage that's going to it? And I think that, over time, maybe there are some ideal ranges of how the pie should be distributed.
Wonderful. Okay. I'm so sorry we can't get to all the questions.
We could talk for another 2 hours, I think.
It really does sound like you can add another hour to this conversation and it would just flow. It would really just flow. So thank you very much, Dr. Barbara Smith. And thank you, Jeff, for facilitating what was fantastic. I really appreciate you coming in and doing these Writers Roosts. They're always a great time. It was always a great time and it's always well attended. There's always things, always events occurring here at OISE. I just wanted to highlight a couple before we wrapped up today. On February 24th, you can join us for OISE's lecture series with Professor Nina Basha on the impacts of teachers' work during COVID-19 and how the administrative structure of the provincial school system worked against teachers' ability to engage safely with children. You can register at a link I will provide in just a short bit. As well, on February 25th, a one-day conference called the Black Boys Education Conference takes place here in Toronto. You can learn about improving educational equality and Black student academic performance in the United Kingdom and Black masculinities. It's a really great conversation, really good litany of voices coming in from overseas. So I would encourage everyone to go to oise.utoronto.ca and you can click on the calendar that is on our homepage, and you can access all the information about these events under View All Events. I hope you all enjoyed this conversation, and you guys have a great evening. Take care.
Thanks so much, Barry. Thanks, Barb. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.